Hi, everyone. It's Caroline here, and welcome to this week's podcast. If we haven't met already, I've spent more than 20 years working across media and the corporate world, watching how work is changing from the inside. Each week on this podcast and in the companion article that I publish on Substack, I look at one topic that's reshaping work and what it means for you and for me as well. This week, I'm talking about time. So your time, my time, and specifically whether companies still value it. We're living through an era where employees are routinely expected to go above and beyond. I hate that phrase, when required at work, and hiring freezes where people leave companies and their roles aren't replaced. We're just expected to absorb the workload as whoever's left behind, even if that eats into our personal time. And then even before we get to the company, there are excruciatingly long recruitment processes these days where you're expected to give away hours of your time for free to do multiple rounds of interviews and assessments. I've got lots to say on this topic, as you can tell, so let's get into it. So just to give you my personal perspective on this to start, as I always do, I've become increasingly protective of my own time as I've gotten older. And I'd say there are probably two things that really changed my attitude towards my time and how it's used. Now, the first was unquestionably having a child. So my son, he's 10 years old now, but before that, staying late at work or giving up a few hours on a weekend, it didn't necessarily feel like a big deal. It was my spare time. I might have preferred to be doing something else, but I had plenty more of it. So I could suck it up every now and then, and even for some extended periods of time, even if I didn't love doing it. Having a child completely changed that calculation for me. Suddenly I realized that an hour I gave to work was potentially an hour I was taking away from him. And there are only so many hours in the day that I can give. And this was particularly when he was very young. I felt really acutely that he was only going to be young once. He was only going to want to hang out with me for so long. And thank God I did, because these days as a 10-year-old, I'm often persona non grata to him. I knew I couldn't get that time back later because I happened to have an important deadline at work. Now, the second thing that changed my perspective, aside from having a kid, was leaving corporate 5 years ago and starting my own business. So in case you don't know what I do these days, I work for myself. I provide, consulting freelance services back to corporate businesses and also to leaders, particularly around content and communications. But what I quickly realized was that when you work for yourself, particularly as a provider of any professional services, time has a very obvious economic value, and you don't always see that when you're an employee. So my time is one of the things my business sells. If I spend 5 hours doing something for someone for free, that's 5 hours I can't spend doing paid work. I can't spend it building my business or doing something else with my life. There are no magical extra hours in the day. So somewhere between having a child 10 years ago and starting a business 5 years ago, I became much less comfortable with something that I'd accepted without a whole lot of questioning for much of my corporate career. And that being the idea that companies are somehow entitled to our time beyond what they actually pay for. We see this idea of reasonable overtime in employment contracts in Australia. I'm not sure how common it is elsewhere in the world, but we do see it here. We see it everywhere in people being expected to go above and beyond when the job requires it. And we see it when working late becomes evidence that someone is committed to their career. I mean, I've been there, done that. I fell into that trap too, where I thought, if I stayed late and I was visible, that would get me ahead, and that showed that I was dedicated. And increasingly, I think we're seeing it right now before people even get to a job. So look at the current job market. I'm reading a lot about this online. So some recruitment processes now involve an initial screening call, multiple interviews, some assessments, psychometric testing, presentations or take-home tasks, and then perhaps, another conversation with somebody more senior. For the person who eventually gets the job, you could argue that some investment of time is reasonable, but what about everyone else? So what happens when you ask 20 candidates to complete assessments that take 4 to 6 hours? Then perhaps 5 people make it through to a stage where they're expected to spend even more hours preparing a presentation or completing some kind of task. Collectively, the company can consume hundreds of hours of people's time just for one role. And those people might already have full-time jobs. They might have children or caring responsibilities. They might have older parents or pets. They might have to take time off work to attend interviews. An hour-long interview can involve preparation beforehand and rearranging the rest of their day around it. Yet the thing is, none of that time appears as a cost to the company. And, I think if candidates pushed collectively for some form of compensation for overly onerous processes, we'd probably see those processes condensed dramatically because companies certainly understand the value of its own people's time. So senior executives have tightly managed diaries. Recruiters have to think about and account for how much time a hiring process is consuming internally. Meanwhile, candidate time doesn't appear anywhere on the company's balance sheet. So effectively, it's free labor. And, I've actually had a little evolution in my thinking on this in recent times. I used to think this was primarily just an issue about respect. So companies should respect people's times. We should all respect each other's time. Managers should respect boundaries. People should be able to switch off at the end of the day if they need to. I now see that we have a much bigger structural problem underneath it because the way we organise work around time comes from a very different era and a very different world. There's a famous essay from the 1960s by the historian E.P. Thompson called Time, Work Discipline and Industrial Capitalism. Thompson looked at how industrialisation changed people's relationship with work and time. Before the Industrial Revolution, a lot of work was more task-oriented. So there was something that needed doing and people organised their work around completing it with particular skills that they provided. But industrialisation in the 19th century changed that. So factories needed people in particular places at particular times. That was because machines had to operate on schedules and work became increasingly organised by the clock or around time. So, back in those days, you arrived at work, you sold your company a defined number of hours of your labour, and at some point you clocked off and left. You've probably seen those old cartoons, I think it's the Flintstones, where a whistle blows and everyone clocks off and walks out on the dot of 5 p.m. or whatever it happens to be. It created a physical boundary around work. You walked out and that was it. Now, of course, that's a really simplified version of industrial history, and I'm certainly not suggesting that working conditions were somehow wonderful in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They definitely weren't. But you look at the underlying model, and that to me is fascinating because we've retained a version of that model in modern knowledge work, even though many of the conditions that created it are long gone. So what do I mean by the conditions are long gone? So most of us are no longer standing beside a machine that requires our physical presence for 8 hours a day. We have laptops and phones. We have email, we have Teams, we have Slack, we have God knows whatever else your business is using. We can work from home, we can work from an office, we can work from an airport or a hotel room or sitting on the couch after dinner. I've done all those things. And obviously that flexibility has created some benefits, but there's another side to that. If you can work from anywhere, you can also work everywhere. So there's no factory whistle anymore. There's no physical moment when work actually ends. So essentially, we've kept an employment model based around companies purchasing blocks of our time while progressively dismantling many of the boundaries that once contained that time that they'd purchased. So that, in a nutshell, is why I have a problem with phrases like reasonable overtime. If I've signed a legal document saying I'm contracted to work 38 hours, surely 38 hours has to mean something. Of course, there'll occasionally be something urgent that needs to get done. There'll be busy periods and deadlines. I run a business. I understand that things can come up without warning. But in my line of work, when you contract with a client, that looks like making amendments to the agreement or swapping deliverables or charging a rush fee or an extra cost for the deliverable. It's not delivered on top of what you've already agreed to do. So just to make it clear here, I'm not arguing against hard work. What I don't particularly like is when exceptional effort becomes part of the operating model. And I think this becomes particularly important when you look at what's happening with corporate work right now. So lots of companies are cutting workforces, they're removing roles, and sometimes they're not replacing people when they leave. Some of that lost work might disappear, or perhaps it's automated by AI or whatever else you've got in place. But the fact is a lot of it gets redistributed to the people who are left behind. So someone who previously had one set of responsibilities takes on another area or part of another area. Or a team of 6 becomes a team of 4, but a lot of the work that team was responsible for still needs to happen. So workloads are expanding without salaries expanding alongside them. So senior management leadership teams, they like to report this upwards to the board and to shareholders as productivity and doing more with less. You've probably heard both those terms thrown around quite a lot recently. I think we need to be really careful about that. There's a huge difference between improving productivity and pure work intensification. And that difference is if technology allows me to produce the same amount of work with less effort, that's a genuine productivity improvement. If you remove 2 people from my team and I have to work harder or longer as an individual to absorb a significant amount of their work, that's a completely different kettle of fish. If that work doesn't fit within my contracted hours, where does that extra capacity come from? That's my personal time. The company has effectively transferred part of its labour costs to me. So instead of purchasing enough labour to complete the amount of work it wants or needs done, my personal time becomes the buffer instead. Now, this is where I think work can start to become what I call extractive. I use this word a bit, and it's essentially getting blood from the proverbial stone. If a role routinely requires 45 or 50 hours of work every week, I think we need to stop pretending it's a 38-hour job. And once I started thinking about it that way, it also changed how I thought about all these conversations we're having about AI and productivity and removing people from the workforce. We keep hearing that AI is going to make corporate workers dramatically more productive. And maybe it will, but I'd like to know who gets that productivity dividend. Let's say AI means I can complete in 30 hours the work that previously took me 38. What happens to those 8 hours? Do I get any of them back? Do I get more flexibility because I'm producing everything the organisation needs from me and everything we agreed I needed to do when the company hired me? Or does the company get 8 additional hours of output outside what I was contracted to do? Or do we somehow share the benefit? I mean, these are rhetorical questions because I do know the answer to that. Most companies will simply say that I get more work, and that creates a pretty strange incentive. If becoming more efficient at my job simply means somebody fills the space with more work, why would I want to advertise the fact that I can now do something in half the time? Okay, now right here I want to put forward some of my thoughts on what this all means for the future. I actually think we need to reconsider some of the fundamentals about how we organise and think about corporate work. And I've been saying this for a little while. Maybe the future of flexible work isn't really about whether we spend 2 or 3 days in an office and some time at home. Maybe it's about what we're selling to our employer. Do we still need to sell them our time if the boundaries around time are disappearing? Perhaps for some types of knowledge work, we then renegotiate it. Now, obviously, like I said before, there will still be deadlines or times when people still need to be available. There'll be meetings and collaborations and unexpected problems. And this wouldn't work for every job. There are plenty of roles where being available at a particular time is an essential part of the work. But for knowledge work where outcomes can be defined, perhaps we need to ask why we still default to the idea that the employer owns a large block of someone's day, regardless of what they produce within it. Now, this isn't some radical idea I'm touting here. There have already been management models that have explored versions of this. One is the results-only work environment, or ROE, which focused more heavily on what employees achieved rather than when or where they worked. Now, I'm not suggesting that's necessarily the answer, just that there's precedent for this. And I also need to point out that there are obvious problems with purely outcome-based work as well. Companies could simply keep increasing the required output until people end up working even longer hours. There would need to be really firm contractual arrangements in place if this is the model you wanted to use. That being said, whichever model we use, somebody still has to answer the question of what's a reasonable amount of work for one human being. And maybe that's the question we've all been avoiding. Because at the moment, companies, to me, can sometimes get the best of both models. They can say they're paying you for 38 hours of your time, then they can give you an amount of work that routinely requires more than 38 hours to complete. And if you don't finish it, perhaps because of interruptions or circumstances beyond your control, there can be questions about your performance. And if you work the additional hours required to finish it, the company gets the additional labour without having to pay for it. And that's probably not particularly sustainable for human beings in the long run. So what's the theme running through this? When you look at recruitment and workforce cuts, unpaid overtime, and now AI productivity through the same lens, I think there's a common thread running through all of them. Companies don't really value our time in the same way we do, or perhaps more accurately, companies value time very differently depending on who's paying for it and whose time it is. If 100 hours of executive time are wasted, that's a significant organisational cost. If 100 hours of candidate time are wasted during a recruitment process, that cost sits with the candidates and it's not recognised or acknowledged. If a company needs an extra, let's say, 500 hours of work or labour every month after reducing its workforce, hiring someone to provide those hours or people to provide those hours has a visible cost to the company. However, if existing employees absorb those hours through heavier workloads, skipped lunches, late nights, or working on weekends, whatever it happens to be, much of that cost essentially is invisible on the company's accounts. So the shareholders might be happy, but potentially the employees are not. The thing is, even if it doesn't appear on the balance sheet, the time hasn't suddenly become free. Someone else is paying for it. Employees are paying for it. And you know what? That absolutely sucks, because time is ultimately the one resource every one of us has that has a limit on it. We only have so much time. There's actually a line of philosophical thought going all the way back to ancient times, like the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, that points out how weird it is that humans can be incredibly protective of their physical possessions while being much less protective of their time. And I understand that much more now than I did when I was younger. Money and stuff comes and goes, but time with your young family or whoever it is you care about in your life, it isn't there forever. So just to wrap up, the next time a company asks you to donate your time that it hasn't actually paid for, whether that's as an employee or as a job candidate, I don't think you should treat it as a small thing. And I definitely don't think willingness to give away time should become a measure of someone's commitment or ambition. There is no glory in being the one who loses their personal time for free to work. If time is the employment bargain, then the boundary around that time needs to mean something. And if outcomes are the bargain, on the other hand, perhaps people like you and me deserve much greater control over how we use our time to achieve those outcomes. Maybe at the end of the day, the future of flexible work isn't about where we work necessarily. Maybe it's about giving people back greater ownership of the one thing they can never replace, and that's their time. If this episode has got you thinking, I've explored the idea further in this week's companion article on Substack. Whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, or through your favourite podcast app, you'll find the full piece linked in the show notes. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If you'd like more conversations about the future of work, AI, and careers, please subscribe for weekly updates. Until next time, take care.